Hello, everyone. Dr. Ames here. This time I'd like to talk about some introductory material on the nonprofit and voluntary sector. It's one of those interesting things about this particular sector is that arriving at a single term to sort of say what it is and sums it up has a long and conflicted history. Today, the usage is the nonprofit and voluntary sector, but a lot of people are certainly referring to it as the nonprofit sector. It doesn't really matter. I think most of us understand what we're talking about, but the confusion really with just the naming of the sector itself comes from the very diversity of activities we see done by the organizations in this sector. Programs are delivered through formal and informal organizations. So the activities as well are carried out by salaried staff and by paid workers, but also by volunteer staff. And that last, volunteer staff, is something we don't see in the other sectors. Activities in this sector are supported by donations and contracts and commercial revenues of a variety of types. Sometimes the nonprofit simply has to go out and make the money they need to survive for themselves. So, one way that the sector is often explained and looked at is that it's that contested arena, it's that area between government and the marketplace that exists where ideas are pursued, notions of giving back and helping, of charitable interests and being philanthropic, all of those concepts come into play. This is where public and private concerns meet and overlap. Yet, quite often, we find that government is not up to or willing to solve every societal problem, and it's not necessarily the province of business, the private sector, to solve society's problems either. So it is that sort of area in between where we take care of things that need to be taken care of, that we're not able to do with our other institutions in society. So it is a place where individual needs and social needs are united. Those people who have an idea for a mission or to pursue some charitable sort of venture thrive in this atmosphere. But that is why coming up with a real definition of the sector is difficult, because many of the core features and the activities of nonprofits increasingly overlap. And their activities are increasingly overlapping with those of government and of business. We find that there is more competition than ever in the voluntary, nonprofit and voluntary sector. And that often there's competition between the sector and also just business itself. So the nonprofit sector today is a visible and very compelling force in society, and in its own way is also a mass of contradictions. Now, today, when we look at it, there are more than 1.5 million registered nonprofit organizations in the United States. Now, the way to look at this is there are mostly formal organizations that have gone through the paperwork and the time to register with the IRS as an official nonprofit organization. But we also have what's known as voluntary associations. These are informally organized community groups, usually, who perform some nonprofit types of functions, charitable functions, and so forth. There are several million of these in the country. To give you an example of a voluntary association that has not filed for nonprofit status legally, would be like, say, a group of bikers, a biker club, who do a rally to support some charitable cause. Um, they're doing something charitable, they're doing the sort of things that happen in the nonprofit sector, yet they're not a formally organized group, but they do to come together to do these sorts of things. Now, the formally registered organizations fall into two very broad and very porous sort of categories. Those nonprofit organizations that serve the public and those nonprofit organizations that serve their members. So we have a classification in the IRS code The IRS code is simply a bunch of laws that the IRS uses to guide its operations. And indeed, it has the weight of law. It is the legal code. Well, Section 501, subsection C, subsection 3 lays out the first formal type of charitable organizations or public serving organizations. And so what we find is 501c3s is the common way to refer to these charitable organizations. They operate in almost every human endeavor imaginable. Let me just read you a few examples of where we find 501c3 organizational activity. Uh, Social service agencies that help children, those agencies that help the elderly, those agencies or nonprofits that help the poor, independent schools, private colleges, community clinics, private and nonprofit hospitals. A good example there is St. Jude's. And you may have seen a lot of commercials for St. Jude's. Of course, where does an organization like that get money if they don't charge their clients anything? They get it from charitable donations and philanthropy. Um, Others that like this of C3 organizations would include think tanks, environmental organizations of all types, from Save the Ocean to Save the Whales to Save the Gorillas, you name it. We have environmental organizations. And then cultural groups like museums and theaters and historical societies, and a range of international assistance organizations that go beyond our domestic borders and indeed tackle problems and causes uh, in an international sort of setting. These are probably the most visible of all the organizations that we see out there are the 501c3s. Now, the next classification is the member serving, like you see here in the graphic. Now, these are in classification 501c4. These organizations and types of organizations serve their specific members, yet they're still nonprofits and they still serve a cause or an idea, or they are helping society or some specific group in society in a certain way. So, some good examples are credit unions, business leagues of all types, service clubs, veterans organizations, trade associations. And these trade associations, we see them all over the place. For instance, the U.S. Dairy Council, that's a trade association. They set the standards of proper behavior and ethics for their industry, depending on the power of the agency voted to it by the members and so forth. They may or may not have the power to enforce them, but they certainly do set standards. And we see these sorts of organizations in all major professions like engineering and medicine and law, and indeed, even in education and so forth. So, um, these are a different sort of charitable or operation serving specific members, but nevertheless still are nonprofit organizations. And so there are other member serving organizations out there who are not necessarily considered 501c4s, but the government treats them slightly differently because of their status. And here I'm talking about the vast array of organizations like churches, synagogues, mosques, religious congregations, official ones. Normally, we would think of as membership organizations, but they are treated differently by government. And we'll explore some of those notions and ideas as we move through the course. And even the oversight that we see out there with those sorts of organizations is not quite the same, and it comes from a little bit different perspective. Okay, folks, that's all I want to talk about this time. I'll talk to you again soon.